Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are tuning in from. Thank you all for joining BuildStrong America's webinar on the FEMA BRIC Building Code Plus Up. Today, we're going to explore with our amazing partners from FEMA, Liberty Mutual, the National Emergency Management Association, or NEMA, and the state of Alabama, how we are all implementing this wonderful initiative. My name is Natalie Enclade, and I am the Executive Director of BuildStrong America, an advocacy organization that unites a diverse coalition of dedicated stakeholders. We are all really interested in sharing this commitment to reducing disaster costs and fostering a more resilient America. Our vision encompasses proactive mitigation of risks associated with natural, technological, man-made events, creating a nation that thrives in the face of disasters. In October of last year, FEMA announced that it was making $1 billion available in grant funding for its annual BRIC program, or Building Resilience, Infrastructure, and Communities program. As part of this long-awaited fiscal year 2023 notice of funding, they announced a building code plus up. BuildStrong has long called for the BRIC program to set aside funding for the adoption and enforcement of building codes through various means, responses to information from agencies, but more importantly, through the Resilient America Act. We were thrilled to see FEMA and applaud FEMA for their commitment to enhancing community resilience and disaster preparedness through the inclusion of this plus up funding. The multi-million-dollar allocation of funds underscores FEMA's dedication to ensuring that communities across the nation are better equipped to withstand and recover from natural hazards and other emergencies. By investing in the development, adoption, and enforcement of modern building codes, FEMA is proactively addressing one of the key components of disaster preparedness. So today we're going to dive into this plus up a little bit deeper. We're going to explore how the funds can be used to build more resilient communities and why communities should take advantage of this inaugural funding. We've developed a great panel for you today. We will have time for questions at the end. So there's the Q&A button down at the bottom. Feel free to use that and submit some questions for our panelists. Today, diving into this topic, we have an incredible lineup. We have Camille Crane. She is the BRIC section chief at FEMA headquarters, where she is responsible for managing this massive program. We have Dr. Kelly Heride. She is the Director of Catastrophe Research and Development at Liberty Mutual Insurance. As a research scientist in the insurance field, she navigates a unique confluence of science, risk management, economics, and policy. We also have Secretary Rush Strickland. He's pulling double duty for us today. He is the Secretary of Emergency Management for Maryland, as well as the President of the National Emergency Management Association, or NEMA. And last, but certainly not least, we have Director Jeff Smitherman, who runs the Alabama Emergency Management Agency, and he's also the co-chair of the Alabama Resilience Council. So we'll go ahead and get started. Camille, we'll start with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. BuildStrong has long advocated for the creation of the BRIC program, and part of that advocacy was conditions around building codes. We've learned a lot since 2018 with the implementation of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. The primary lesson that we've learned is that states just don't always have the capacity to adopt or enforce a statewide code. And we were obviously thrilled to see FEMA take administrative action on this issue. This is the first time that FEMA is offering this funding, hopefully not the last, to really create that foundation of supporting more resiliency and more building code programs for communities. Can you share a little bit more about this program and specifically like how can communities use this?
Sure, absolutely, Natalie. Let me start with saying thank you, Natalie. Thank you, BuildStrong, and thank you, Liberty Mutual, for hosting the conversation today. Building codes are a priority of the BRIC program, and they have been since our first or inaugural year of offering in FY20. And they have always been an eligible activity under our state and territory allocations, as well as our tribal set-aside as it relates to capacity and capability building activities. With 3 years of BRIC cycles under our belt, one thing that we love about the program is we have the ability through continuous improvement to look every year at what's coming in and then recommend potential modifications to the program to hopefully make it improve. And so we had seen a handful of building code sub-applications come in and be successful through the state and territory allocation and the tribal set-aside, but not as many as we wanted. At the same time, we wanted to be supportive of efforts such as the National Initiative for the Advancement of Building Codes. So what we've done as we look at the FY23 Notice of Funding Opportunity, as Natalie said, it came out in October. It is valued this year, or the program value in our NOFO is $1 billion. And so within that $1 billion, we have kept steady our state and territory allocations in our tribal set-aside. So those are $2 million for every state and territory and $50 million for federally recognized tribes. And they can use these allocations as they have in past years for both capacity and capability building projects, as well as mitigation projects. So building codes are still eligible under the state and territory allocations, as well as the tribal set-aside. But what's different this year is we've created what we're here to talk about today, which is the building codes plus up. So this is another $2 million for each state and territory to spend on just building code work, either at the community level or at the state or territorial level. In addition, we've created another $25 million for building code work under a tribal set-aside building codes plus up. So that is $25 million for our federally recognized tribes that come directly to FEMA to apply for building code work. It is important to state that the applicants, so those that can apply directly to FEMA, include states, territories, the District of Columbia, and federally recognized tribes. And then those that are sub-applicants, so they apply to an applicant to apply to FEMA, include local governments as well as other state agencies, tribal agencies, or territorial agencies. So as we think about the deadline for the BRIC program, as we stated, the Notice of Funding Opportunity came out in October, opening the application period. The application period closes on Leap Day, February 29th, 2024 at 3 p.m. Eastern. This deadline is the deadline for applicants, so states, to package all their sub-applications and submit them to FEMA. What is very important to remember there, as we are on January 23rd today, is that sub-applications are due to states. And so they set, usually states, territories, and tribes will set internal deadlines of when sub-applications are due to them. So it is imperative, if a local community is interested in this, they need to be in conversation with the state that manages the BRIC program, traditionally an emergency management organization, to understand deadlines. If for any reason that has passed, building codes continues to be an eligible activity, or has been an eligible activity, as I stated, throughout the life of BRIC, and you want to be in those conversations with your state partners or your territorial partners or your tribal partners to understand how they run the BRIC program from an applicant standpoint. As we talk about what is eligible under the building code activities, both in the plus up or in the regular state and territory allocations and tribal set aside, we support building code activities at all levels of government. So local governments, state governments, territorial, and tribes, particularly in 3 main areas. The first is if a community or organization does not have building codes, we can support the work to adopt building codes, as well as then the implementation of those codes. If a community has adopted code, for example, they want to update it to a more recent code, or they want to implement additional work that would have higher standards or regarding the implementation or enforcement, that kind of work can be fundable as well. And then finally, we have the work that is about developing professional workforce capabilities. related to building codes through technical assistance and training. There are a number of resources that are available outside of webinars like today. So that includes on the FEMA YouTube channel, we have about a 20-minute webinar we put out on demand last, I believe, around November, with staff that talk about more detail about what this plus up is and the importance of building codes. We also have the program support material. So if you are an adult learner that needs to hear things and read things and touch things in different ways, there is a program support material on our website, fema.gov/BRIC, that talks about in writing, it's a few pages long, talks about how to apply and what is eligible, as well as the notice itself, the NOFO itself, which is available both on our website and grants.gov. So with that, Natalie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Camille. We are getting some questions in the Q&A. So just as a reminder, if you have any, please pop them in there. We will get to them towards the end of the webinar. So Kelly, you are up next. We could probably spend all day long talking about building codes and why they're important for communities. But as it says in the title of our webinar, this is action focused. So we are trying to make it more action focused for the audience. So Kelly, can you give us a quick highlight about the different benefits that updated building codes can provide communities, and maybe a couple of examples of what they might look like for different hazards or catastrophes, please?
Sounds great. Well, thanks for having me today, and I appreciate getting a chance to talk to everyone. We're in a situation where climate-related hazards are clearly going up, right? We have increases in our most extreme hurricanes, increases in extreme rainfall leading to flash flooding, increases in temperature are driving bigger and meaner wildfires. So what do we do about that? There are essentially two different buckets of action that we can take, and this Plus Up program can really help us on both. There's the mitigation side, which means reducing our emissions to make the hazard not get worse. And then there's adaptation, which is dealing with what is already baked in and what's already coming down the pipe. So on the mitigation side, I like to think of this as when you find yourself in a hole, step one, stop digging. So what can we do to reduce carbon emissions in a way that can potentially reduce these hazards going forward? And there is an opportunity here to invest in building energy efficiency as a way to cut those emissions. Now, building code improvements in energy efficiency are kind of like the grape nuts of climate adaptation. You know they're good for you, but gosh, they really sound boring. But I want to argue that not only do those help us with making sure that climate-related hazards aren't getting worse, they can actually help us from a climate-related disaster standpoint. So as we see things like heat waves increasing, by improving building efficiency, that helps to cut the demand and the strain on our energy grids to help protect grid stability. So we can make sure that the power doesn't go out at the point where people need it the most. And if it does go out, it helps to make sure that people can stay in their homes safely for longer while we work to get that back up. From a community stability standpoint, it also offered an opportunity to put stable blue-collar jobs that pay well into your communities, because one of the big bottlenecks that we see is on electrification. So electrician is really one of our most amazing climate-related adaptation jobs that's around. So by sort of enforcing and putting together building codes that support the move to electrification of things like home mechanicals, installing heat pumps, things like that, you're putting those jobs in those communities and protecting them for the long haul. So that's the mitigation side. That's reducing carbon emissions and sort of helping stabilize your local communities. But what we really think about the most is the adaptation side. So that's dealing with what we know is already coming. So if your climate-related hazards are going up, you have really two options. You can just eat that, or you can work to offset those hazards by decreasing your vulnerability. So reducing the impacts of those hazards on your communities. So according to the National Institute of Building Sciences, adopting the latest building code saves $11 per dollar invested. So this is a really cost-effective way to deploy your funding. And working with the insurance industry and our research partners like the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, we continue to identify ways to improve and reduce risk in a cost-effective way. For example, the IBHS, that research institute, recently put out a variety of wildfire prepared home designations for things that you can do to reduce the risk to homes from wildfires. So if I'm thinking about how to do community protection, we need to think not just for individuals, but how the protection for individuals rolls up to the entire community. So that means making sure that communities can remain financially self-sufficient going forward into the future. Because as you see properties being impacted by these increases in hazards, you are actually potentially threatening your property tax base. There was a recent study arguing that flood alone may be causing properties to be overvalued by up to $200 billion in the United States. And if your properties are overvalued, that means your property tax base is potentially at risk. So that means that you're potentially losing out on your money to pay your teachers and your firefighters and your upgrades to community level defenses to make sure that you are prepared for the climate risks that are here to come. So by investing in protecting your property tax base, your individuals, you're helping to make sure that your community can protect itself going forward into the future. But I want us to make sure that we don't just think about homeowners, although that certainly is important. We need to think about critical employers too, because if a hurricane comes through and everybody's homes are fine, that's excellent. But it's even better if we make sure that those people have a job to come back to afterwards. So thinking through sort of keystone employers in a community like school systems and hospitals and large manufacturers can help to make sure that lights stay on after a disaster. So what does this look like for, an individual hazard? What's a good example of what this can look like? So we're going to hear a lot about coastal hazard in a second, so I will leave that to those folks. But I want to talk a little bit about wildfire because this is a sort of an emerging area. We've seen a lot of change in wildfire risk recently, and there's really concrete things that you can do. And some of them are actually pretty inexpensive. Things like clearing out vegetation and brush from around your house. Don't store firewood next to the wall of your house. Putting screens on attic vents. Putting in place fire-resistant roof and siding. And we can pair that with landscape scale defenses like prescribed burns to materially reduce our risk. Now, it's one thing to say that, that can reduce the risk, but we have concrete examples of how this has actually happened in practice. So the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history just had its 2-year anniversary, which was the Marshall Fire. It destroyed 1,000 homes in Colorado. And we really saw the impact of changes in building code in practice during this fire, because there was this amazing story that came out about one of the communities that burned where a subset of the homes in that community had been built roughly in the 60s and 70s. They were doing everything right according to the building code of the 60s and 70s that was in place at the time. And unfortunately, every one of those homes burned to the ground. But across the street from that community was a new one that had just been built with updated fire-resistant building codes. And even though they were so close to their neighbors that they literally had melted pieces of their neighbors' homes stuck to their siding afterwards, not a single one of those new homes in that community was lost. We can't prevent every climate-related hazard or climate-related disaster, but there are things that we can materially do today to not only reduce our risk today, but also reduce our risk for decades to come for the climate change that we know is coming down the pipe. And that is why we need to be focused on investing in this program, and we should really take advantage of this opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. A lot of really good information around wildfires. BuildStrong and our partners at NEMA, we're working with the Hill on getting some updates to wildfire policy. So we're really excited about that. But let's get to our coastal friends. So Secretary Strickland and Director Smitherman. So we're going to turn to both of you to kind of help the audience understand. Kelly just went on and on about how great how building codes are and how they're helpful. So Russ, as Secretary of Emergency Management for Maryland, but also the leadership of NEMA, could you maybe start by sharing some examples of how funding for building codes can make a difference in the real world over in Maryland?
Well, we're very fortunate in Maryland in that we do have a statewide building code, and we have a system for that that building code that all the local jurisdictions participate in. I think what is probably most interesting and maybe hopefully acceptable to FEMA, and I'm looking at Camille on that one. I'm going to list, some of the areas that here's a state that we have a statewide building code. We feel it's reasonably accurate. We do update as required through that process, but we see the opportunity for this plus up to help us increase transparency of and accessibility to the building codes. That will create a central repository of local floodplain ordinances and adopted building codes, including identification of higher standards for every community in the state. So that's one area we're looking at. Enhancing building codes statewide. We want to coordinate the Maryland model floodplain ordinance, create a state floodplain ordinance, and develop elevation certificate data for state buildings and make improvements to the review of state projects based on the FEMA's state assessment. Another area that we're looking at for, again, this plus up is evaluate higher standards for resilience. We'll complete a cost benefit analysis of adopting these higher standards tied to a floodplain outside of the SFHA for state facilities, and then a case study for community adaptation of higher standards tied to a local floodplain and higher standards resource. So we're really kind of trying to build the data that'll show for the future what benefit this would have. And then finally, building codes training and local land use policy workshops. We want to develop and implement a robust statewide training program for flood provisions in building codes and local land use policy workshops that tie flood provisions, building codes, ordinances, higher standards and regulations to land use policies. So for us, it's an opportunity to put these 4 areas into action, work closely with our Department of Planning, as well as our pertinent other departments that we work with on all of our flood management, to really kind of build up these areas and also allow us to be in a better position to adopt future codes as we go through, and to get our local communities more involved. It's really an educational process too with that. So that's from the Maryland perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. We'll come back to you in a few minutes about the national perspective there. But okay. Turning to Jeff, Alabama has been doing some groundbreaking and innovative work. I was about to say down there, DC, so specifically the Alabama Resilience Council, which is a partnership between your agency and the Alabama Department of Insurance. That's a great example through the Strengthen Alabama Homes. Can you share a little bit more about maybe those projects or how building codes can make a difference in your community and or your state, and kind of what are y'all planning on doing with the building code?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. First of all, thanks to the group who sponsored this and put it together. I appreciate the opportunity not only to talk about Alabama, but it's actually caused me to learn more about the BRIC program and the state set aside. So it's been a beneficial thing for me personally as I prepared for this. So yeah, about the Resilience Council, I'm really proud of that, and really, I guess I would say I shouldn't have been, but I was stunned by the amount of private sector partners that were willing to join in with that council on that. And it's been a pleasure to see that, and it continued all the way up to actually even today, getting some of the private sector partners involved in our BRIC efforts. So the council basically provides a forum for the different state agencies, state, local, federal, and private sector entities to come in and to coordinate and collaborate in those resiliency efforts. And it's, again, the private sector participation has just been outstanding. and one of the things that came out from the council's initial meetings is, I think I'd had a conversation with Natalie probably close to about a year ago, and I talked about building codes weren't popular in Alabama. There's just not at the state level. But I did find out through that council that I don't have near the size mountain to climb that I thought I had. There are some out there who do understand and appreciate the fact that we need them. They may not know what they think they know, or may not know what they don't know, but at least right now they're in the right place to be some assistance on that. The Strength in Alabama Homes, and I will say this: the Strength in Alabama Homes is as what we've seen come from the success of that, is a big part in the approach that I think the state's going to take on what we do with the state set aside and plus up that's available to us. So the Strength in Alabama Homes, it's a program that was enacted by legislative act in 2011, and it provides a grant to the citizens or residents here in Alabama to fortify. They're using the fortified program to retrofit their roofs, and it started in the coastal counties of Mobile and Baldwin County, and very successful there. And what we're working with the Department of Insurance is moving it northward and open it up to the counties whose primary. So it started with homes that were subject to the threat of hurricanes, but it's a high wind mitigation effort. So now we're looking up into our north and northwest portion of the state to take that program and expand it up there, so that we can do the same for some of the smaller rated tornadoes. So we're seeing success in that, and it's just one of the things that's kind of fearful for us as a state, as we watched some of the things that's happened elsewhere. There's a concern. We want to set a standard or a marketplace that's attractive to the insurance industry, as we've seen some leave some states because of the marketplace just wasn't as attractive maybe as it once was. We want to make one of the side benefits of the building code efforts and the Strength in Alabama Homes effort and fortifying the homes is that it's not as damaged as heavily. Therefore, the insurance risks are lower. And one of the things that we're talking with Department of Insurance, the council co-chairs met last week, and one of the things come out of the conversation, or that I learned from that conversation, is there's a metric that says once you achieve this number of fortified homes, it starts to make a statement in the marketplace. And we as a state are just about at that number. So, as soon as we start to see that, I think that's going to be a very attractive selling point as we start to talk to the legislature and some of the others for statewide codes and stuff. And we say, look at this program and see how it has impacted in true savings, and document those savings in insurance. And it's bigger than just the rate decrease. There's other things that impacts that. So I am not an insurance person, but we've got some really good people in Department of Insurance that know that, and in the conversations, they're trying their best to educate me on it. But that is a program that we as a state are very proud of. And it's funny when Natalie, I think his name's Roy Wright. I might help me there, but he came and presented at the council's first meeting, and it was interesting because he had a color-coded graphic that he presented. It was a photograph, an aerial photo of I don't know, probably about 10 or 15 homes were in the picture, and it was color-coded. All the homes that were not fortified homes were color-coded blue. Those were blue tarps over the roof, and any of the homes that weren't color-coded blue were fortified homes. So it made a lasting impression of homes side by side. One's fortified, one's not. You can just measure and visually see the impact difference there. So that I guess, unless you want me to get in and start talking about the BRIC and the codes itself, one of the things I think the new grading on the BRIC projects may indicate that if you don't have statewide codes, if that's a local project and that local municipality has codes, that they'll take that in the scoring. I may be off on that. I'm getting that third hand, but that's what I think the new one does. And if so, I'll applaud FEMA for that effort, because Alabama will never be competitive if we're not in the near future, if we're only scored by statewide building codes. But also something that I've been talking about with others is if in Alabama, if I could at least tie whether the BRIC projects, we can tie it to the codes being implemented and enforced after the project is done and make it apply to that. I think that will help us in the model that we see with Strengthen Alabama Homes. Eventually, if you get enough of something good going, then the legislature will follow. So I think what I'm trying to say there is, if I've got enough building code identified and in place by whatever means, I think it will be less scary to the legislature. So that's what the kind of the way Alabama is looking at it, as a ground up on that. So that's all I have on that part, Natalie. So.
Thanks, Jeff. You made some excellent points about FEMA now prioritizing local building codes, and that's something that NEMA has been working on a lot, and they're strong advocate on that part. So yeah, just want to get back to you, Russ, with your NEMA hat on. Obviously, you and Jeff come from coastal states, Maryland and Alabama. Jeff shared some great points about Northern Alabama and tornado. So it's not just flooding that y'all deal with. So with that NEMA hat, can you share a few examples of how the Building Code Plus Up might come to life for other states?
Yes, thank you. And first off, I want you to understand, if you've seen one state out of 50, you've seen one state out of 50. All of us are different. And then you pull in the territories in the District of Columbia. So we kind of set that as the playing field. So the bottom line is we're all different. The second point I want to make is, though, of the 50 state directors, the 6 territories, and the District of Columbia, there's not a one of us that would argue against building codes. We're all in favor of building codes. But again, we're all different, and we may have different needs based upon those differences and what we feel is necessary within our particular state. So let me take the closing comment I have and throw it up front. So, and then we'll go back through it a little bit, and maybe that'll kind of help people understand that, NEMA wishes to see code incentives shifted to the post-award side of the program. This would work by having everyone complete applications on a level playing field and offering cost share adjustments after project evaluation. This would eliminate pitting states and locals against each other and evaluates each project on the merits of the application. So what we're saying is, we're going to work towards statewide building codes without any question. But the point is, every state is different and adopts different levels of building codes for different reasons. And we need to kind of dig down into that and not necessarily hold the lack of a building code against us when in fact there may be a building code in place. And some of the reasons to consider with that is, the home rule status of states, practical political realities, statewide review process all play a role in the different levels of code adoption. The one-size-fits-all approach to building codes won't be successful nationwide. What the state of Maryland needs and the state of Arizona needs are 2 totally different codes in general. Now, I'm not saying there's not a baseline there, but in general, it is different. And this will exacerbate, the haves versus the have-nots when it comes time to the underlying issue, trying to encourage better construction. And it also messes a little bit here with the whole competitive process for the BRIC program. So we want to be careful with that. The current code incentive for BRIC acts as a disincentive for some of the states, including an evaluation of code adoption as part of the application process is not promoting code application, but rather discouraging BRIC applications. What we want to do is see mitigation be the center of the universe. And what we want to see is everybody engaging in their state within their capabilities, the ability to mitigate before disaster hits. And building codes will help with that. But a one-size standardized nationwide building code is not going to work. And we've got to take into account how is it each state can present what they have. Now, I think we've got the greatest opportunity to work on that with the plus up. There should be no state in the nation that says, well, we can't do anything. Well, you can, because FEMA is offering you $2 million here to start that process so you can have a statewide building code that meets your statewide needs. And I think that's what we need to continue to push and work with those jurisdictions. And FEMA needs to work with those jurisdictions so that they are a good competitor and a fairness and equity is there within that competitive process across all of the BRIC applications. And I'll be quiet for a minute.
I appreciate those thoughts. I completely agree that one thing that we have noticed, especially since the passage and enactment of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which created BRIC, we've learned a lot, as I said up at the top, about building codes and just kind of how different states adopt and enforce them or don't adopt and enforce them. It's not up to the emergency manager or the Secretary of Emergency Management of a state to adopt those codes. So that's something that we've been working on, especially with you guys at NEMA and our other partners on that. So with that, we can go ahead and take a couple questions, unless Russ, did you have more that you wanted to mention on?
No, I'm interested in what comes up in the questions and how we might be able to clarify if necessary.
Perfect. So we did pop in the chat the links that Camille was talking about. FEMA does a great job at getting that information out there. It's just really hard. Start drowning in all of the information. And so we're really glad that they recorded that webinar, which is great. So that is a resource for you. Let me check these questions real quick. Camille, you may have addressed some of these, and they'll definitely be addressed in the recorded webinar through FEMA, but just so we can pop them up. Would FEMA see it appropriate for a state submitting for the full $2 million plus up to require locals to adopt the most recent codes in order to qualify for the state funding local needs through the plus up grant?
So yes, a state can apply for the funding to take in-house, because it sounds like you're talking about mandatory building code adoption at the state level. So yes, that would be eligible. The funding can be used in combination or solely by local government, state government, and then of course there's territorial partners and tribal partners. So you may have a situation such as Secretary Strickland is talking about. Interesting to hear about what you guys are going to be submitting. So you have a state there that has mandatory code adoption, and so is looking at how can they improve, or how can they get more information out about the code, how can they better, how can they get more access, how can they train. And they're going to use what it's sounding like Maryland's going to do is they're applying for the funding to basically be able to do that, will get the mandatory code adoption more improved, for lack of a better word, in the state of Maryland. That's an option you can go down. There's the opposite of that, where you may have a state that doesn't have mandatory code adoption. And you may have a state that's not right now on the radar. That's not something that there's really an appetite for in the state. But the state may then in turn have local governments that very much care about about building code adoption, building code enforcement, building code training. And so the funding may all be at a local level being funneled up through a state application, but they're actually a series of sub-applications that a local government is creating. You may have a hybrid of those two. So you may have the state use part of the funding for their efforts and also use part of the funding for local government efforts through sub-applications from counties, parishes, cities. So it's a, it's a what do your heart desire a little bit about how you would like to administer that $2 million in each state and territory, as long as it's a combination or all falls within that basic 3 big buckets of eligibility, which is about adoption, enforcement, updating, and training.
Excellent. Thanks, Camille. Also appreciate you saying parishes. As a New Orleans native, we usually don't get acknowledged like that. So thank you. All right. I'm trying to work this Q&A thing. Okay. One question, but if you have not adopted the most recent additions, you would still likely be eligible, correct? Correct, yes. Okay. Did you want to comment on that or?
You do not need building code adoption to apply for building code funding, because you can use the funding to adopt.
Excellent. All right. So we have a comment here, HR 7070, the Wildfire Response Improvement Act, which was introduced yesterday by Representative Stanton and Representative LaMalfa, will be a real game changer in managing wildfires. Completely agree. We've been working really closely with the Hill on updating FEMA guidance to take into account wildfire and not treat everything like a flood or a hurricane on the public assistance side, Camille. All right, next question. So this would be for you, Jeff. Will the Plus Up in Alabama be used to carry out the same mission as Strengthen Home Alabama's Act? As in Plus Up funds being used to provide residents grant funds to fortify their homes, more like regular infrastructure project statements of work.
Yeah, that was not necessarily our intent. I don't think I did a very good job of explaining when I tried to make that connection. So what we're seeing from the Strengthen Alabama homes is that as you get more of them completed, and it starts to impact the marketplace, we see benefits. Well, and there's codes. We view codes the same way. If I'm successful in getting some codes down inside some jurisdictions, and enough jurisdictions and areas adopt them and go and people start realizing, oh, well, that's not so bad. I'm actually seeing a benefit from this. We're hoping to have a ground level up approach to it, because if I continue to try to present it to the legislature, as I'm going to throw it to Kelly on this one, I'm still trying to have them eat grape nuts, and they don't like grape nuts. So it's I guess that's the pitch I'm trying to get to, is that if we get it out there in enough communities, and those communities voice them, that well, I guess I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, because I get myself in trouble all the time. But when Natalie and I attended a program, and we had to introduce each other to the program, and I go, oh, I understand your job now. Your job's to make building code sexy. And so, and I was serious about that, is that we have to politicians don't run for election or re-election based on, I'm going to bring in building codes. So we have to change how, at least for us in Alabama, have to change what we're talking about. So instead of building codes, we're talking about what can we do to make the insurance marketplace better, so our residents see a decrease rather than an increase in rates. So I think if we change the dialogue in that manner, then it's no longer the grape nuts. It's some more flavorful cereal.
Thank you, Jeff. Building codes are very popular. Everybody loves to talk about them. Makes you really popular at parties, especially at the elementary school with your child rolling their eyes. But just a clarification question. Did I hear on this call that FEMA is now scoring proposed projects for local code adoption with state preemption, rather than penalizing projects in local jurisdictions with more advanced building codes for being in a state with older codes?
So I think that's to me. So we talked, there's $1 billion in BRIC. We talked about state and territory allocations, 112 million, state and territory plus ups, 112 million, tribal set asides between regular 50 million, building code tribal set aside, 25 million. That leaves in the bank $701 million for a national competition. Our national competition is mitigation projects, and they are scored on this year a 200-point system. So if you've been a fan of BRIC, or you've been sitting in the theater watching, eating your popcorn while you pay attention to what we do every year, you'll notice there's a little differences in our competition criteria almost every year. It has changed over the years. From the initial years, we focused almost all of our building codes criteria points on state adoption, less on local adoption. In our second and third years, we moved to where those were balanced between state mandatory adoption and local building code adoption. Moving in now into year 4, we have decreased the overall weight of building codes in the competition. So last year, for example, they were altogether worth about 40 points in a 230-point system. This year, they are worth 20 points in a 200-point system. There is a larger emphasis, more points on local code adoption and local code enforcement, with a smaller amount of points, 5, regarding state or applicant, in the case of that it's a territory, mandatory building code adoption. So you have local points worth double than the state. We also, being heard from our stakeholders and we're able to implement, there are some places where there is no code at either, no building code, I should say, at either the state or local level. So we have a out where you can still get 5 points if, for example, your project is a flood mitigation project and while you don't have building codes, you have higher floodplain management standards. So looking at potentially, then you still can get some points. So you can get 5 points out of the 20 total, even if you do not have a code, as long as you can show you have a higher standard in the hazard type that your project would mitigate. More information can be found about that on the BRIC website. We have program support material. They are super handy for the national competition. They outline this 200-point system and how to achieve the points based both through technical criteria and qualitative criteria. One of our regional administrators calls them the keys to the test. So if you are putting in a national competition, I heavily recommend looking at those program support materials for our competition criteria. Those are the same materials we provide our panelists, so the peer reviewers that review the sub-applications. So hopefully they're easy to read. We're always willing to take feedback on how they could be improved. Please, 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 please look at them if you're thinking about submitting to the national competition.
Thanks, Camille. Just to reiterate, FEMA has a ton of information on this. A former FEMite, I will say this, it's not always the easiest to find on the website, so it's just easier to Google FEMA BRIC and it will pop up like that. Don't necessarily try and go to the FEMA website and think it'll be right there. Okay, we have a question for Kelly. How do we handle the increased costs associated with building codes?
Yeah, so, of course, everyone's like, well, building codes sound great, and then somebody has to pay the bill. But I want to push back on this concept that this has to be an expensive fix. One of my favorite examples of this actually comes out of Hurricane Michael, which, as you'll recall, hit the panhandle of Florida as a Category 5 hurricane. And in one of the communities that was hit by Hurricane Michael, it was a little bit inland, so it didn't get the Cat 5, but it got about Cat 3 level winds. There was a community that, a lot of homes ended up losing their roofs. But as we were going through the aerial imagery afterwards, and it came out in the press afterwards, there was a little cluster of homes that were built by Habitat for Humanity. And Habitat for Humanity is really informed by the research that's associated with, the fortified standards that, for example, Alabama is using. And there we learned that the most important thing to protect a home in a windstorm, like a hurricane or a tornado, is to keep the roof on. And it turns out that's not all that expensive to do. So even in this, very deliberately very low cost housing, there's a clear example where, you know, these homes made it through the hurricane just fine, where all of their neighbors were essentially wiped out. So I want to push back on this concept that this has to be an expensive fix. There is low cost stuff, throwing in an extra couple of sets of nails, you know, helping to seal your roof deck is, you know, maybe an extra couple $100 on the cost of a property. So it doesn't have to be expensive and can really have a large impact. But then for, you know, so sort of the larger and more heavy duty fixes, I want to share something that some of our more sophisticated developer clients are thinking about. Because, you know, you can invest in upgrading your properties and upgrading, you know, to reduce your risk. And then, you know, you end up selling that property, or, you know, the developer finishes the project and is done with it. You know, they may not see a hurricane during the time period where they own that building. But those more sophisticated developers look at it as an opportunity to help protect the future property value of whatever project it is that they're working on. So by offering, you know, that investment in resilience to their clients, yes, there's a change in the upfront costs, but it's a way for that developer to actually capture some of that future value of, you know, 10 years down the line, that building survived a hurricane that it otherwise wouldn't have. You know, otherwise the developer sees none of that, but by sort of bringing that forward through that investment in resilience, it benefits the ultimate property owner. You know, they get a building that will still survive, and it helps to benefit that developer. So that's a way that they're thinking proactively about, you know, it helps their business model, and it also helps sort of that broader goal of reducing risk.
Hey, Natalie, this is Jeff. Can I add something to what Kelly was just commenting on?
Please do.
So in the meeting last week with the Department of Insurance, one of the things they were telling me is down on our coastline, when the housing market is competitive, they have found that when these developers go in and build out a subdivision and they're applying the gold level standard of the fortified homes, and that's how they're preparing those homes as they build them, they're finding that gives them a competitive edge over others. And they say, hey, in this community, my homes, we've built to the gold fortified standard, the Strength in Homes Alabama. So, you know, I think eventually that's going to drive the market. Right now, that's a competitive edge. It won't be long before it's no longer a competitive edge. But when it gets to that point, I think the housing market will reflect. So you will see some maybe second and third hand offsets on the prices talked about, whether it be, I know our Department of Insurance is working with the providers in Alabama to establish basically to demonstrate that you're taking into account with your rates the fortified homes, and looking at recalculating some of those costs and benefits over a 3-year period. So I don't want to get too detailed into that, because I am not an insurance guy, and I didn't stay at the Holiday Inn either. So, but there is some initiatives in there that I think offset what are the initial maybe cost of being compliant with a stronger building code.
Thanks, Jeff. I just want to highlight quickly a program from one of our other partners, Flash, the inspecttoprotect.org. It's really cool. You can go and see when your home was built, and then find out what else you can do to bring it up to the current standards. So for example, if your home's built in the 1950s, it tells you what you need to do. And then it's even cooler because it puts like a little dollar sign. Yes, this is going to be expensive or not that expensive. And you'd be amazed at how many things only have $1 sign showing that it's reasonable. We are almost out of time, so I have one question to wrap up with all of you. We sit through a lot of webinars and seminars, specifically in our field, where there's a lot to talk about, so we admire the problems and we don't always get to action steps. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to give one action item or an action step or call to action related to building codes for our audience today. Keep in mind, there's a ton of different sectors out there. So we'll start with Camille. What is your call of action?
Thank you, Natalie. And I'm going to do a combo because that's the way I am. I think my first is thinking about what Secretary Strickland said, that every state is different, unique, and that is true for communities as well. So the first is, wherever you are, in the world on this webinar, whether you work for a local government, you work for a state, you're a private contractor. You have to begin the conversation. You have to understand where you're at in your community, right? Are you in a place where you don't have any code? And so the first conversation is about how do we take that first step? Are you in a community that has advanced code? And so it's about how do we go to the next iteration? So you have to understand the world that you sit in, or where you live, what the kind of appetite and opportunities and where you're at. And then from there, it's all about partnership, right? Whether it's submitting a grant, whether it's adopting code, whatever it might be, you're not going to do it by yourself. So who do you need to be talking to? Particularly if you're wanting BRIC funding, you're going to be needing to work with most likely your state hazard mitigation officer. And one thing I always want to point out is, Natalie, you started the conversation with saying this is an annual program. And so we want to recognize that while this funding opportunity for FY23 has an application deadline that closes in just over a month, there will be a BRIC program next year. And so it is never too late to start having those conversations with the people that manage this program. Thank you.
Thanks, Camille. Kelly, what's your call of action?
Thanks. My call to action is, this is use it or lose it. This is a real opportunity. Set up your building code design and your building code administration for success and to be more competitive for other pools of funding, like other BRIC funding in the future. So if you're trying to think of what kinds of hazards you need to think about and ways that you can reduce that risk, your insurance partners can help.
Excellent. Thank you. Secretary Strickland.
And let me give a call to action to emergency managers in general, because I think this is really important. And I think it goes back a little bit to what Camille's saying, and even hits a little bit on what Kelly's saying. And Jeff, you got to figure it all out and tie it together here at the end. But the bottom line is emergency management is way above and beyond involvement in things that we've never been involved with before. But there's one area that we have really got to step up in if we're going to truly mitigate before the event occurs. And that is that every emergency manager needs to get involved at the local level, the county level, the state level, with what the process is with planning. And I mean community planning, developments, that kind of involvement, so that we can say and sit there at the table, we need to think about this, we need to think about this, we need to think about that. We're disaster focused, unfortunately, and we need to be. But this is our opportunity, or a call of action perspective, to get involved with the planning process of your locality so that you have input immediately and you can make a difference for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Director Smitherman, what is your call of action?
So it's more refined into the local, but Russ, I think I can tie it into what Camille and Kelly were saying. So we're trying to figure out how to use, so I've got to break the insanity. We've been insane for the past few years that we've tried the same thing over and over again and it hasn't worked. So I'm like, we got to change our approach to this. So we're looking at using the BRIC Code Plus Up with state set aside and have those two funding opportunities work together to, one, to help us identify scope and seek out those who can put together a good BRIC project and working that from the ground up. So we've got to find the communities who are willing to establish codes, get those established, do a BRIC project, and basically do that, as I said earlier, from the ground up. We've got some great partners helping with this. I have one, I won't say who they are, but a major utility company here in Alabama that has stepped forward and said, hey, it's in our interest to help you get a BRIC project done and get some of these building codes done. So I actually have a major utility that's seeking to partner with us to help communities draw up some projects. And so that's kind of the result of what we can see out of the private sector in conjunction with their participation in Resilience Council. So that I think that's it for us is using both of those programs on a ground up philosophy. So I appreciate the comments from Camille on that it's all the locals are different as well, because the ones on the south look up at the north and view that totally different. And the ones up north look at the coastal counties and go, well, all you have to worry about is hurricanes. And it's just bigger than all that. So thanks, Natalie.
Yeah. Well, we are at time, and I am so grateful that y'all joined us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience for coming. And with that, I will leave you with Secretary Strickland always says, mitigation is the center of the universe, and building codes are kind of the center of that. So thank you all for joining us, and reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody.